Audio Unleashed. Oh, hey, I forgot to tell you before we started rolling. Happy anniversary, buddy.
Why?
This is our first year anniversary. This episode.
Oh, wow. Great. Good. Congrats to us.
Yeah, absolutely.
Congrats to us. The money's rolling in. And
no, nobody's put out a hit on us yet. So that's
responses through the roof. And,
yeah.
And, you know, all of the charlatans in the audio business have run for cover.
Oh, wouldn't it be nice if that were true?
Yeah, but then what will we talk about?
Well, I've got a good idea. Why don't we start with that, by the way?
Okay.
I've got a blog post from John Seo of Benchmark Audio, and the blog post is called Audiophile Snake Oil. So basically, he just, interestingly enough, I think one of the coolest aspects of this blog post is that he talks about the history of snake oil, which not a lot of people understand. I think that's neat. But he talks about the, audiophile snake oil, what people are basically, I guess the long and short of it would be marketing BS that he's fighting against here, and this sort of prevalent notion that spending more money is going to get you way more performance.
Yeah.
That's going to be kind of a recurrent theme in this episode. But he ends the post with an audiophile checklist that I think is going to make for interesting conversation between the two of us. But we'll get there. What do you want to talk about?
The next segment is going to be about something I saw on Stereophile. And actually, I think I got a press release for this. So I was like laying in wait for it to appear on somebody's website. It's about the Sidourney Acoustics spherical dual speakers. And this is like a kind of funky looking speaker. I think they're $4,600 a pair, I think, or something like that with stands. And it's a couple of 5-inch drivers in these like cast aluminum spheres. I thought this would give us a great chance to talk about some of the physics of speakers, because there's so much, especially once you start to get into the high-end audio realm, there's a lot of speakers that are built as if we haven't learned anything about physics in 70 years. And I wanted to talk about that and talk about how people can look at a product like this and just do some quick calculations in their head or on their phone or whatever, and figure out what that product's going to do. The people that really know speakers tend to look at a speaker and know what it's going to do. I mean, you can't always tell exactly, right? If you give me a two-way speaker and I don't know what the crossover is, I can't tell you if it's going to work. But if you tell me what the crossover is, I can tell you, yeah, it probably worked. And this speaker is flagrantly in violation of the laws of physics. And I thought, it doesn't mean it's not going to... It pleased Jason Victor Serenis at Stereophile. He didn't go into great depths about the inner detail, but he did say it sounded good. But we're going to go into that. And arm audiophiles with the knowledge to where they can look at this stuff and figure out if it works or doesn't work in terms of, following the laws of physics. And that doesn't mean they don't want to buy it, but it means, caveat emptor, which I think means if a speaker looks weird, think twice before buying it. My Latin's not too good.
The ancient Romans were known for their thoughts on speaker design.
Yes. So what's next?
Next, John Darko, whom we talk about a lot on this podcast, posted what I thought was a pretty innocuous meme. Would we call this a meme? I think it's a meme.
You're the young person. You know what a meme is. You were sending me memes long before I knew what they were.
Oh, man, we're so in trouble if I'm the young person. Anyway, so Darko posted something on social media that basically boiled down to diminishing returns is a thing. And Lee Scoggins of Part-Time Audiophile took issue with that.
No, wait, Lee's of Absolute Sound, isn't he?
Oh, I thought it was Part-Time Audiophile.
He was publisher of Absolute Sound. I don't know. Maybe he's bumping around a little bit. Who knows?
Yeah, there you go. So Lee took issue with the whole, concept of diminishing returns, and says there are many examples where this chart does not hold in terms of sound quality. And then our dear friend, Soundstage founder Doug Schneider, chimed in on the conversation too, and it got a little bigger. And then that ended up spilling over to his Facebook page. So I've seen you pop up in these conversations. And so I thought, we would just talk about that and talk about what does 3 times the sound quality mean? What is something sounding 3 times better? Like, what does that actually even mean? So
I have so much to say about this.
Yeah, I'm going to be listening a lot because I'm going to be entertained. It's not that I don't have thoughts. It's just that yours are going to be so much more entertaining than mine.
I've been kicking around a long time, and I've heard all this crap for, since I started reading audio mags in around 1990. And, geez. And so our Patreon segment is going to be, we just saw this on Darko's website. It's a phone from Moondrops, which is referred to often as a Chi-Fi brand, Chinese high fidelity. And they're kind of known for making in-ear monitors that are by and large pretty good and pretty affordable. And so they have a phone now. And I just saw this thing. I was like, oh my God, this is like the answer to my prayers. I think it is, because it's $399 and it's cool. And it's got a headphone output with like a real decent headphone amp on it. So you can drive, maybe not like the craziest stuff from Hi-Fi Man, but you can drive the non-crazy stuff from Hi-Fi Man.
Yeah. Well, hey, before we get to our first subject, let's start by digging into the mailbag because, man, we got a lot of response to our last episode. Yeah. And I think because we are corrupted by money, like everybody is, we're going to start with the patron first.
Okay.
Because, hey, he's keeping the lights on, man. So this is from Mark Snyderman, who left this comment on the Patreon posting of our last episode. He said, hey, guys, love the podcast. You've had so many great segments, including in this week's episode, and always done with such good humor. But I have to take exception to this episode's segment on crappy but popular music on Spotify and elsewhere. My reaction is the same as it is every time I read Joya's incessant rants on the subject. And he's talking about Ted Joya, who referenced in that piece. Who cares if other people are listening to crappy music? They obviously like it or they wouldn't be doing it. And don't tell me Spotify forces them to listen. Nothing is stopping anyone from looking for other music. And then he talks about Taylor Swift. That's a little bit of a digression, but he ends with something that I thought was relevant. On the planet I inhabit, this is the greatest time for music in human history. There's more great music, including new music, more readily available to more people than ever before. Lighten up, guys. Enjoy the music and stop telling everybody else to get off your lawn.
Well, we're not telling anybody not to listen to anything, are we?
No.
What we're saying is that the music is more robotic. Look, it's just the almost like the laws of physics, right? You look at the top 40 from, even the 90s or even the 2000s, I guess, and there's more real instruments. The vocals are less processed. There's more humanity to it. Now, if people want to listen to the new Taylor Swift Post Malone song, which is called Fortnite, I think, which I have listened to.
Wow.
What do I care? I couldn't care less. But, I agree. I mean, I saw, honestly, one of the best jazz concerts I've ever seen in my life. A guy named Chris McCarthy, who played with his group up in Bellingham, Washington. And holy crap, it was just as good a jazz performance as I've ever heard. It was just phenomenally good. And, I'm still out there searching for stuff. But, I just really don't the top 40 to me just doesn't grab me these days, but it might start. I'm not saying it won't start. It might.
I have a slightly different take on it because people often treat us as if we are a hive mind and we have the exact same perspective on things. And in many ways, you and I are quite opposite. My wife describes us as if Felix and Oscar actually liked each other. So you've got the perspective of a musician. And I, a lot of times, have the perspective of a deranged left-wing lunatic. For me, what was relevant about the last episode is the anonymity of the people that are making this music that is
exactly.
So
that was the point.
And so the reason I think that is relevant is because what benefits the streaming service is if you're not thinking about who's making this music. If you just press play, let them do the thing, they're controlling it. And that to me is scary.
Hey, can I read the next letter? It's about Eric Alexander. So, I want to
Do it.
All right. This is from Tyler Reinberg. Right with you guys until 24 minutes, where it was said that Eric Alexander was kind of a victim. And that's the guy from Tecton Speakers. That's, I think it's fair to say, harassing Aaron Hardison about his review. The guy is a malignant narcissist and has exhibited that on the internet for well over a decade. A large percentage of the audio reviewing community does deserve serious criticism for all those things that were mentioned and more, but blaming Eric's behavior on the review community is pure nonsense. Also, you guys keep saying his speakers work fine until you get off axis where they're a hot mess. Okay, I have a lot of issues with this. First of all, I mean, malignant narcissist, that's name calling. We don't do name calling here on Audio
Unleashed.
Except sometimes I call people idiots, but whatever. But I can always make the case that they are. Anyway, unless you make the case that he's a malignant narcissist, anyway, a large percentage of the audio reviewing community, we're not really talking about the audio reviewing community, kind of whatever that is. We're talking more about the publications, right? We're not talking about Aaron's Audio Corner. We're not talking about Danny Ritchie or anybody like that. We're talking about publications. We're talking about Stereophile, which is publishing this garbage. Who else do we talk about? Home Theater Review, right? Which published this garbage. And so we're criticizing the publications, not the reviewers as much, although some of those reviewers are pretty lightweight, as we said. And, if his speakers do work fine, John Atkinson's measurements show that his speakers work fine. Aaron's measurements show his speakers work fine. And they don't have a problem off axis. So unless you can cite measurements that prove that they have a problem off axis, then nope.
Yeah, there's another comment in that same thread that really stood out to me. It's from William Kramer.
Oh, this one was great.
Well, he's talking about the fact that the audio industry has got to change. And he says, the audio companies that will exist in the future will embrace that people don't have the patience for being sold magic beans. I see too many articles written about the need to get millennials into the audiophile community. We don't want to be audiophiles. We have very good BS meters. The audiophile infrastructure feeds BS by the spoonful. Aaron reviewed a product that actually performed decently, but the owner of the company was upset that no one was left with a shit-eating grin. And I think this is just amazing because it's proving a point that I've made many times. Every time I say, we got to do this to get, younger people in audiophile, some old dude comes at me and they don't care about sound quality because they're just listening to Taylor Swift. They're happy with their earbuds. And it's like, no, they do care about better sound. They just don't want to be part of your cult to enjoy it. So, William, you're spot on, buddy. Yeah.
Good letter.
Yeah. So anyway, let's get to the discussion of this blog from Benchmark.
Okay.
John Ceo's audiophile snake oil blog post. John wrote this post that I thought was actually pretty brave, although in a sense, look, Benchmark is not selling $9,000 power cords. And so you could argue that if they were selling $9,000 power cords, they wouldn't have written this blog post. Not. But they do make some pretty, not super, super pricey gear, especially in today's audio market. But I would say at the upper end of affordability. But anyway, he just goes through and talks about, like I said, the history of actual snake oil, where that phrase comes from. But he talks about also, this is the part that I really loved. He talks about the market craves a cure-all, and he's talking about Clark Stanley snake oil and promising instant relief, the strongest relief for pain and lameness, for rheumatism, lame back, toothache, sprains, swellings, etc. Anyway, the case that he's building is like, man, if you're suffering from these things and you haven't found a good solution otherwise, you're going to be susceptible to the snake oil stuff. But then he goes on to talk about like audiophile fuses, right? Mm-hmm. And the claims that they make, dramatic new levels of sonic realism, wall-to-wall, floor-to-ceiling sound staging, unparalleled resolution, dynamics, and frequency extension, guaranteed results. Like, who wouldn't want those things if you could get them, right? I mean, that's why this snake oil works. All of these things are like, those are laudable things, but that doesn't mean you're going to get them from a $595 fuse. And I really like the fact that he's making that distinction.
You know what thrilled me about this article is he doesn't sit here and say, oh, no, this stuff doesn't make a difference. He actually talks about how, something like a speaker cable could make a difference. I was hounded by Alan Devontier, who's like the head of audio research for Samsung. When he was working at Harman, he hounded me into doing speaker measurements with different cables because he said, you're going to see a difference and it's going to be probably audible. And I did. And yeah, you could, under certain circumstances, you could see where there was an audible difference, but a very small difference. And it's not like, oh my God, this is some kind of magic, bumping up, an octave wide band centered at 3K by 1 decibel because you have a slightly different impedance. Because you could do that with an equalizer. It's not worth $10,000 to do that. But he does acknowledge that these things can make a difference. And I think if people realize, like, okay, yeah, these things can make a difference. I mean, if you blind test them, can you hear that? It's possible, but is it a big deal? It's absolutely not. I mean,
but I always go back to, even if it does make a difference, is it, okay, which one's better?
Right. Which one's better? It's just that's why I said in my original article when I did that, which was on about.com, which is now called something else. It's like how do you determine if it's better or worse if there's like this slight bump at some frequency? Since you're dealing with, let's face it, I mean, you're dealing with a speaker which is a non-flat product. So if it's plus or minus a decibel here or there, ultimately hitting your ears, is like, what? I don't know. Is it better or worse? And it's silly to think that it's somehow revelatory of the meaning behind John Coltrane's whatever something. It's just a bunch of crap. I really liked his audiophile checklist down at the bottom. Did you see that?
I was gonna ask you about that. I was gonna ask you what you thought of the ordering there, because I got a few little nits to pick.
Okay, well, music, first and foremost, because if the music, look, I'm really into music. I have been my whole life. I play it. It's devoted a lot of my life to it. And music is first and foremost, and a great tune to me can sound good over a Bluetooth speaker, a crappy Bluetooth speaker at that. Speakers, absolutely. That's what makes the biggest difference. Room treatments, I'm going to have to say that the room treatment thing is within audiophile circles is, I think, overstated. Because you do get used to some of that. And, it's not, Floyd Toole's book has the definitive, to me, analysis of this, scientific analysis with listening tests. And so much of this is like people see, run a measurement and they see a big hump in their response and they freak out, where it's like, it's really not that big of a deal. Power amp, yeah, maybe. Preamp and DAC, whatever. Cables, sure.
See, I would put the preamplifier before the amplifier in terms of importance.
Why would you do that?
This is backed up by Diego's measurements. I've heard volume controls make way more of a difference than the topology of the amplifier, right? I think it's a really good volume control, especially one that is well balanced, that is consistent across its operating range and things like that, can affect things like imaging and soundstage, far more than an amplifier ever will.
Plausible. Certainly if you have a potentiometer as your volume control.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Ideally, if it's like if it's like a digital resistor ladder or whatever, digital volume control, those should not have a significantly different sound. But pots, oh my God, they're really wildly inconsistent.
Oh yeah.
I've measured this before, and he's Diego's right. So I largely agree with what he says here, more or less. But
I 90% agree with it. Yeah.
So, I'm not going to argue power amp versus preamp. It's like, they both have a very modest amount of, it's like you don't want to just buy anything. You want to put a little thought into what you're buying, but it's not like speakers where it just makes this giant difference in your system's sound. And anybody who says, everything in your system is important, it's just, I'm glad that John said this, because, what does he make? Makes power amps. DACs.
And DACs and preamplifiers. Basically, everything that he makes is in the last half of this list.
Yeah, and that's pretty bold. Okay, that's really bold. So I really admire that he did this, and I don't know if it's going to have any impact, but probably not. It's kind of like we're so deep into religion, and you can't argue against religion. So you can, but you're wasting your time.
Yeah. I think a few elements from this blog post are going to come up later in the John Darko, Lee Scoggins, Doug Schneider feud. So we'll put a pin in this and we'll come back to it. But you want to take a break and get some water, and
let's do that.
Come back and talk about these spherical dual speakers.
Yeah.
All right. We'll be right back. And we're back. This is Audio Unleashed. And we are going to talk about something that we missed in our in-depth, definitive Axpona report from last episode, in which that
we
was for
didn't
patrons,
go.
Wasn't it? That was for patrons.
I think it was. But
our
like
mass
we don't
audience
go to the
didn't get to
shows.
hear any of it. Yeah.
We don't go to the shows, but we talk about what other people say about the shows. And so I was kind of laying in wait for this one because I got a press release about it. I'm like, oh no. And so Jason Victor Serenis wrote it up for, this is Axpona. This is a big show in Chicago that happened a few weeks ago. And he wrote it up for Stereophile. And he talks about these speakers, which are the Soderni Acoustics spherical dual loudspeakers, and they're $4,600 a pair with integrated stands, and they're pretty cool looking. Not what I'd spend $4,600 a pair on, but whatever. So each of the enclosures for this thing, it's like these sort of spherical enclosures with a little doohickey on the bottom, and there's two of them for each of the speakers. And they're joined by a metal pole that goes kind of up in between them, or up through the middle of them, right? So they're kind of stacked onto this metal pole. It's actually kind of an interesting design. But each one of them uses two 5-inch full-range dynamic cone drivers, right? So it's a mid-woofer, really. And I think something people probably don't realize is that a lot of mid-woofers do have response up to 15 or 20 kilohertz, right? I saw these and I just looked at these. As soon as I got the press release on them, I'm just like, how can we still be doing this in the year 2024? When we knew better, we probably knew better in the year 1924. Maybe, certainly in the year 1964.
Yeah.
I saw these and I'm kind of like, I wanted to talk about them because I have not heard them, but I can like everybody who's done a lot of speaker measurement and who's read the loudspeaker design cookbook can look at these speakers and tell you what's wrong with them right away. I'm kind of like, the guy who designed them hasn't read these things, or if he read them, if he's read the loudspeaker design cookbook or Floyd Tools book or whatever, he's sure ignoring them. So I wanted to talk about how you figure out if a speaker like this works or doesn't work. And when I say works, I mean, look, sound comes out of these things. I'm sure. I'm quite confident of that. That's not a big ask.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that you couldn't walk into this room. I mean, Jason Victor Serenis, who's heard a lot of systems, he liked the sound, but he didn't rave about it or anything. He just said it sounded excellent. Okay, well, anybody can say that about any system. I've said that.
Well, he said it sounded full, well pitched, just plain excellent. So
okay, well,
yeah,
all right, yeah, whatever. I mean, I've got a Bluetooth speaker here on my desk that's $80. I have described it as sounding full for its size, and I haven't just well pitched. I'm quite confident that if you put a certain frequency into it, it will not shift the frequency. And excellent. Well, compared to other speakers of its ilk, it's a top wire cutter pick and has been for about 5 years. So, and that's in blind testing. So it's excellent, I guess.
Yeah.
So anyway, each one is basically two sort of spheres, and they're joined in the middle, and the spheres are slightly tilted, just like a few degrees each way, in terms of up and down. So, which, could improve the dispersion a little tiny bit. What happens is the speakers are about probably 6 inches apart. I mean, 5-6 inches apart. Let's say 6 inches. And so I wanted to go through the calculations that I go through in my head when I look at this and go, that's not going to work. At least it's not going to produce a sound that is consistent with what we've found to be the sound that most people like, right? That most listeners enjoy. And in fact, that is consistent with what you might hear from a set of recording monitors or something like that, right? This will sound different from what the artist heard in the studio. Absolutely. You might like it, but if you're paying for this, you're paying for something that is way out there. And let me tell you how I did it. You want me to go through the math?
Absolutely, man.
Okay, so these, first of all, when you there's two things to consider here. There's what's called beaming, which is where the speaker forms a tight beam of sound instead of dispersing it broadly. And there's also lobing, where you have two speakers that interfere with each other, right? And so the sound waves come out of the speaker, and depending on where you are in position to the two speakers, they'll move in and out of phase, right? You get what's called comb filter effects, right? And they say that because it's like a comb. And so you'll get, this thing will produce, any two drivers that are right next to each other and carrying the same signal, right, are going to reinforce each other. If you're dead on, they're going to reinforce each other. But as you move up or down or sideways or whatever, in this case, if you move up or down, your ears are going to be closer to one than to the other. And so they're going to be out of phase, and they're going to partially cancel each other. So as you move up and down, you'll hear it start to go. When you put on pick noise.
Can I interject something?
Yeah.
Phenomenon related to this that some people maybe have some experience with is something with center speakers called the picket fence effect.
Yep, exactly the same thing.
Yeah, so with center speakers, sometimes you can just if you're sitting straight in front of it, sounds tonally neutral, whatever, you can move your head back and forth a foot, and it sounds like you're listening to the sound through a picket fence, because it gets dull and then it gets bright, and then it gets dull and then it gets bright. So
yeah, that's if they're not made bright. I mean, you can easily design a center speaker with a properly spec'd crossover that completely eliminates that effect. But in this case, there's no tweeter. So there's no crossover. So a lot of people think, oh, there's no crossover, so magic. But I don't know if giant aberrations in frequency response are magic. So the way I calculated this is I took a look at these things. And I go, okay, if those drivers are 5 inches, and typically with a driver like this, the 5-inch measurement is between two opposing screws, right? So if you look at that and go, okay, that's 5 inches. These things are about 6 inches apart. Okay. Now, sound travels at about 1,127 feet per second at sea level, which means that, that's 1 foot, right? So that wavelength, the wavelength of 1,127 hertz is 1 foot. Okay, so 6 inches is half of that. Okay, so what's that get you to? Let's call it 1,125. So that's 2,250, right? So the way you figure out if these things are going to lobe, if the two drivers are going to interfere with each other, is, are they active at a frequency? You take the distance between them, you figure out the wavelength of that, and you figure, are they active at a frequency at frequencies above that? Which here, they're full range, so they are active. If you had a tweeter in there, it wouldn't be so. But these are going to start lobing at 2,200 hertz. or somewhere thereabouts. It's not like a light switch and it just all of a sudden like starts doing that. It kind of gradually moves into it, but it's going to have a lot of lobing problems, and the higher the frequencies, the worse they're going to be. If you had a tweeter on this and you crossed it over 2200 hertz, no lobing. But 2 full range drivers, lobing. There's nothing you can do about it, right? Yeah. Except for filter the sound out of them, above the point where they start to lobe. So again, you take the distance between the drivers, you figure out what the wavelength of sound is, and that's where it's going to start to lobe. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, the speakers themselves are going to beam because it's a 5-inch full range driver. Okay. So the way that you figure that out is very similar. So like I said, these things are probably 5 inches from screw to screw, which means they have a roughly 4-inch radiating area. So same thing. That's a third of a foot. So you multiply 1127 by 3, and you get about 3,400. So these two speakers, each one of these speakers is going to start beaming at about 300, 3,400 hertz. And now that will help eliminate some of the lobing because their dispersion is going to start to narrow at those high frequencies, right? And they're going to be very beamy. So it's going to be more like 2 narrowly focused flashlights shining at you instead of 1. But still, it's not going to have a big, spacious sound to it because these 2 drivers are not dispersing sound broadly like a 1-inch tweeter would.
Yeah.
I mean, a 1-inch tweeter, if you figure, a wavelength of 1 inch is somewhere around 10 kilohertz or something. A typical tweeter will start to narrow its dispersion somewhere above 10, 12, something like that, kilohertz. And that's, to where your ear is starting to become pretty insensitive and there's not that much content anyway. And so that doesn't really matter. But here it's going to make a difference. And these are going to sound colored. I don't care who walked in the room and said they sounded excellent. These speakers sound colored. I can just look at them and tell.
How would you compare these to things like the Orb Audio speakers, which are 2 globes with 3-inch full range drivers?
That's a good point.
The Gallo acoustics, which are 2 globes with 4-inch drivers.
Yeah. Well, Gallo, I'm not as familiar with the Orb line. Gallo, Orb basically copied Gallo. But I will say, I think I wrote a couple of manuals for Gallo or something like 10 years ago or something. I can't remember. I always had a deal where I wouldn't, if I did any work for a manufacturer, then I couldn't review your product until like 2 years after I stopped doing work for you or something like that, right? So I wasn't reviewing your products anyway, so it didn't matter. But I can't remember. I might have done some consulting. I might have done some measurement. I don't know. But so those work better because, well, first of all, they still have problems, right? But those tend to sound pretty good because Anthony Gallo, the guy that did them, he definitely knew what he was doing. Okay. He was not just throwing drivers around. So he used smaller drivers. Now, then you start to get into issues of bass response and things like that. You got to cross them over to a subwoofer a lot quicker. And I should say these Sidourney things have they have an optional subwoofer, all that stuff. But so at least he thought that part through. But the Gallo stuff, you had to cross it over more. But the dispersion of a 3-inch driver is pretty good. There's a lot of little tiny speakers that have like a 3-inch full range that sound pretty good. You can definitely hear the dispersion narrowing once you start to get to, well, that's what, a quarter of a foot. So 4 times 1,100 plus 100 is 4,500. They're going to start to narrow at 4,500. You'll hear it, but it still has a reasonable amount of sense of space. Not as much as a 1-inch tweeter will give you, but decent. And I honestly, I still kind of have a pet theory that something like a 3-inch mid-range driver is kind of close to the dispersion of a human mouth, and so therefore sounds more natural on vocals. And it's a pet theory. Honestly, it dates way back to college when I had Radio Shack Minimus 3.5 speakers that had that, and I love them. Yeah. And they had they were 3.5 inch. They were probably 3.5 inch full range, and I loved certain things about them. And I've always had this pet theory, but then Meridian did a speaker like that was like a 7-inch woofer and a 3-inch full range, or 3-inch tweeter mid-range crossed over at, I don't know, 1.5K or something, maybe 1K. And I thought, oh, finally somebody did a speaker that, conforms to my pet theory. And it was, Meridian, good engineering, they knew how to build speakers. They didn't screw up their speakers, that's for sure. And it was just like, that's okay. I'm so disappointed. I felt like this is going to be the holy grail of speakers, and I will be vindicated, and I will. But no. Anyway, Anthony Gallo made, if I remember correctly, he started doing things that were kind of a little more similar to like line arrays, where he had several of them, and that works because they're going to start to lobe, but there's going to be so many drivers there. That's the way line arrays work, is they lobe, but there's so many of them that the lobing all just basically cancels each other out.
Yeah.
So you don't have the frequency response aberrations. So this is if Gallo, I don't know if Gallo still exists. I think Orb does, right?
Orb does, yeah. Let's see.
So those can work. It's not going to be as spacious sounding as a 1-inch tweeter, but it can still work. Yeah. I mean, I think those sound good. Oh, good.
Yeah, Gallo does. I'm looking at, I just pulled up one of their speakers, the Strato 2. It's got 2 4-inch dynamic carbon fiber drivers. And then there is a cylindrical diaphragm transducer for the tweeter, but there's no crossover between them.
Oh, that's right. They had that cylindrical diaphragm doohickey, which also worked. And I think I measured them, and it was a little rough. But it was kind of overall kind of flattish, but it was not smooth. But just because it doesn't have a crossover, I'm sure that he used to, still does, have his drivers spec'd out closely, and you can spec your drivers to roll off without a crossover. And likewise, he may well have designed his tweeter to also roll off without a crossover, because if you don't, it's going to blow up.
Yeah.
So he must have done something to effectively make a crossover there. So he was aware of the issues, and like I said, I think those speakers can be. Are they the best? No, but they're kind of cool. There was one that Guttenberg turned me on to. They were like these tall plastic cabinets, and they were probably about, I think it had a 3-inch full range, and it was a transmission line loaded design, and I think they were probably about 3 feet high, and they were maybe about 5, not even 5 inches wide, and kind of they weren't a cylinder, but they were kind of heading in that direction. And Kavart and Bolga, sound sommeliers.
Wow.
And they were something like $300 a pair, $350 a pair. And you could get them with cool wraps on them and stuff. And so Guttenberg was raving about them, and he told me about them. I'm like, oh, what the hell? I'll try them. And they sent me a pair. I was like, these sound fine, and these are fun to listen to. They don't have any bass, but a 3-inch driver, even in a transmission line, is not going to have much. I applaud people that do, crazy things with audio, but read the loudspeaker design cookbook before you do any of this stuff, because a tweeter could have turned this into a really cool product. Basically a Diapolito style design. A tweeter and a crossover, and I know that some people think crossovers are evil, but all those people are idiots. So there's my name calling for this episode.
I think that's a good place to stop and cool off and get a drink of water and come back and talk about a feud. How about that?
Oh, yes. Feud. Right. Exciting.
This is like the audiophile equivalent of the Hatfields and the McCoys.
Yeah.
Coming up next. And welcome back to Audio
Unleashed.
Yeah.
And I think my response, that's perfect because we're talking about a feud.
That's true.
And that's what y'all people down south do. That's what y'all do, right? That's where they invented Mountain Dew. And Mountain Dew used to have a picture on the bottle of one hillbilly shooting at another one.
I like how you try to pretend that you're not from Texas and say Wednesday. Oh, anyway, I would probably pretend I'm not from Texas too. But
I'm from Texas.
Anyway, we're talking about a post that started, I guess, with Lee Scoggins, although originally started with John Darko. So John Darko posted this thing that says, no, that 3 times more expensive audio product will not sound 3 times better. Why not? Diminishing marginal returns. And Lee Scoggins took issue with this. He says, love Darko, but he's wrong. There are many examples where this chart does not hold in terms of sound quality. And boy, I wish we could get the kind of engagement that this post got. There are a lot of people.
And then our old buddy Doug Schneider jumped in. And so this inspired it's Darko, Scoggins, and Schneider feuding. So I called Dark and Schneider.
It sounds like a really good beer, man.
Yeah, like Benifer when it was Ben, what's his name, and Jennifer somebody. And so this is Dark and Schneider.
Dark and Schneider.
3 great tastes that taste great together, or something creepy and weird like that. But whatever. Not that these people are creepy and weird, for the most part.
For the most
part. So
there's been some really good responses here.
There have been, and a lot of the real luminaries of the audio industry have chimed in. Which I was delighted to see. Yeah, he got great response on it. And I found out about it. I just stumbled upon it on Facebook. And I was thrilled. There was a really good engagement. A lot of people chimed in with some what I thought were interesting statements. And it was, I would argue, it was a lot less stupid than most Facebook audio feuds.
Okay.
There's conflicting points of view, but they're not. But there's room for that here.
Yeah. One of my favorite responses came from Joe Mariano of Joe and Tell. Good friend of ours. Who, by the way, Joe has said he's finally just about ready to come on Audio Unleashed because he's ready to talk about magic paints. But we'll burn that bridge when we get to it. But Joe had a really great response here and sort of broke it down in terms of, I guess what Joe is explaining here is why he thinks there are diminishing returns. And he says, from going from no sound to being able to hear some music from a Bluetooth speaker, that's a huge jump. Going from a Bluetooth speaker to a pair of stereo bookshelf speakers to get a sense of imaging, that's a big jump, but not as big. Going to some full range speakers to hear more bass extension is a good jump, but I don't think it's as big as no sound to some sound. Anyway, he follows this chain and sort of talking about how, every jump here is a pretty big financial increase, but doesn't necessarily give a commensurate increase in sound quality. People didn't like that. Lee especially didn't like that and said, I politely disagree here as I have experienced way deeper emotional connection with flagship speakers. So I do believe that flagships can be worth their price over speakers costing a fraction in price. I don't know what does a deeper emotional connection have to do with performance, right?
Well, nothing. Or something. I mean, nothing. Nothing in the cases for me, it has something to do with it, right? Like I will have a deeper emotional connection with a speaker that does not sound like, that doesn't beam, that doesn't lobe, that has a decent amount of bass response, et cetera, et cetera. But with audiophiles, that's kind of, their emotional connection comes from, I would say, hey, look, I know audiophiles, which is, people who are interested in high fidelity sound reproduction, who are very excited about genuine quality. But with audiophiles, there are people that are excited about speakers that can be demonstrably shown to have huge colorations.
Yeah.
As we talked about in the previous segment.
I mean, it becomes an identitarian thing.
It's
if
totally
your sense of
identitarian.
self is wrapped up in audio upgrades, right? I mean, it's almost like buying a new speaker is a form of self-improvement to these people, right? So
right, and it is to me too. I mean, I would much prefer to have speakers that I think are cool for some reason than speakers that are necessarily perfect. It'd be nice if they were a little of both, but I don't. With so many of this stuff, these are purchased for status reasons. And I think Carlo Larasso, the editor-in-chief and owner of Secrets of High Fidelity in Home Theater, chimed in with something to that effect, which makes me think he's read that book by W. David Marks called Status and Culture. Whereas some of this is really, you're paying for status. And that's, here's what I think. And I commented to this effect. Darko's chart shows sound quality on the y-axis and money spent on the x-axis. And he kind of is sort of proposing this as some sort of scientific or logical thing when it's really not. And I'll quote him. He says, no, that 3x more expensive audio product will not sound 3x better. The big, giant, glaring problem here is define 3x better.
Yeah.
I mean, I do a lot of measurements, right? I've been doing measurements longer than anybody other than Atkinson, probably, who's still measuring. Everybody else is dead. But I can't define. I can define if I'm measuring cheap Bluetooth speakers, right? And I have a certain maximum output measurement I do on them. And if one of them plays 10 decibels louder and maximum volume is what you're looking for, that speaker is 2x better than the other one, because it's generally accepted that 10 decibels louder is twice as loud, right? So, but that's the only, and maybe in subwoofers with CEA 2010, right? I can make that case that, you can quantify the sound quality. And other things matter with subwoofers too, but the output is by far the most important thing. Because even if you don't use all the output, the sub's going to sound less distorted at lower levels too. So you can't quantify, this is a sort of quasi data. And since there is no measurement of sound quality here, it's like, well, I mean, the way that if I had to rank the sound quality of a product relative to Darko or Scoggins or Doug Schneider or Joe Mariano or you, we'd all take the same product and we might rank it differently because we have different. I review cheap stuff, right? So a $400 bookshelf speaker to me that's flat and performs well is like, oh God, that's about as good as it gets. Yeah, it gets better, but that's awesome. For Lee Scoggins, he's messing around with Magico speakers, which are excellent speakers. I must say, I've never heard a Magico I wasn't impressed with. I never heard the early horn ones he did. I might have not been impressed with those, but all of his tower speakers and bookshelf speakers, I've been like, that's a damn well-designed speaker. So, for Lee, and Lee is, involved with the Absolute Sound. And, so he's definitely buying into the religion of high-end audio to some degree.
Well, he also can't go pissing off his advertisers. Right?
Well, true. Yeah. So, Absolute Sound is a promotional vehicle for the high-end audio industry, right? I mean, they don't, to my knowledge, they don't really have bad reviews in there. They don't do any measurements. So, or if they do, their measurements are certain to be commented on the Audio
Unleashed
podcast because they're just so ignorant and bad and horrible. But basically, I commented on here. I don't disagree with Lee because it's like, the guy who buys a $10,000 amp may be 20 times happier with that than he is with the $500 amp he owned before. How his happiness is determined by a lot of other things other than sound quality.
Yeah.
And he may say, oh, this sounds 50 times better, but what does that mean? It doesn't mean anything at all. My thought was this. You do have diminishing marginal returns where you have products that are not status products, right? Like a hammer is a really good example.
Mm-hmm.
There's no Porsche of hammers. So, and you go buy a hammer at Home Depot or wherever, and the fanciest one, best made one's probably $25, right? And you can't put any more money into it and make it better. That product works fine if you choose, the right hammer for whatever kind of nail you're trying to pound. So diminishing marginal returns is true of hammers, right? And if you did a $100 hammer, it might in some way be slightly better than the $25 hammer, but boy, it's definitely going to be diminishing marginal returns. Okay.
Yeah.
With audio or cars or any other product where there's status involved, right?
Yeah.
You're talking about consumer satisfaction, not some, empirical measure of performance or quality, right?
Yeah.
And in that case, it's up to the buyer. I've heard this kind of conversation for decades, right? And I've heard the law of diminishing returns. Well, there's no law of diminishing returns. In some cases, like a hammer, you have diminishing returns if you spend more money. You could argue that, hey, I can go buy the $350, $400 Triangle Audio Borea BR03 speakers and the WIM amp for $250, which has, Bluetooth and Wi-Fi streaming built in. Is that going to tell me everything I need to know about John Coltrane's records? Pretty close. Tell me probably 98%, 99%. And maybe if I had this Magico system that Lee was talking to, it might be 100%. But I think it's hard to argue that there's not some kind of law of diminishing returns there, because clearly the vast majority of people are moved by music and attracted to music through vastly cheaper systems than what Lee is talking about. And, and Lee is not, when he listens to that Magico system and it's maybe the whole system is $1 million, right? And I listen to Triangle Borea BR03s and a WIM amp for, what is that, $650? Let's just say it's $1,000, right? And he's listening to $1 million system. He's not having a 1,000x improvement over the experience that I'm getting.
And moreover, if there were a screen between him and the speakers, how would that affect his enjoyment? Like a truly acoustically transparent screen, if he could not see the speakers, if he did not know that they cost $750,000, how much would that affect his perception of their worth?
Well, I'll give him credit. I mean, I think that, he's going to be able to tell that that's a good system. Okay. And I mean, he's heard a lot of stuff. He's going to listen to those. He's going to go, okay, this is definitely not the $600 system that Brent's talking about.
Right.
So he'll like that better. But, so is his experience, I would say, honestly, his experience with that is probably, listening to a John Coltrane record is going to be significantly less satisfying than my experience listening to that same record through a $650 system, because I understand the work of John Coltrane better because I'm a musician and I've also studied all this stuff, and I understand what Coltrane did, and I've read about his history and all this kind of stuff, and I've played those tunes. And if you really want the returns, read some books about music or learn to play an instrument a little bit. That'll get you more deep into music than a fancy system will. But however, Lee's satisfaction, Lee's obviously kind of a high-end luxury goods kind of guy to some extent. And, his satisfaction, well, again, it's not going to be 1,000 times more than mine, but, it might be, I don't know, man. How can you rate that? I mean, he's almost certainly going to be going to have a far greater amount of satisfaction with his purchase, and he'll feel better about buying this $1 million system or whatever it is than I do about buying something that's really more of an appliance.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, I don't feel jazzed about the car I own because it's an appliance. It gets me around. I don't care about it. It works perfectly fine.
When I took over Soundstage Access and I sort of was deciding, okay, what is going to be my reference system now for this new publication that's focused on high value audio, I had some choices to make about what speakers I was going to use. And one of the things that influenced my decision to use the Paradigm Studio 100s is the way they look. The wood of the cabinet, the cherry finish, the shape of the cabinet. And I just love, there is something very warm and inviting about the look of these speakers that is perhaps, that gives them value to me above and beyond other speakers that I own that probably perform very similarly, right? So, I do get it, but I think overall, one of the problems that I have with the people who reject the notion of diminishing returns is that there's far too often an element of condescension in their discussion. They think everybody is a frustrated wannabe billionaire who really wants a $750,000 speaker, and they're just mad that they can't afford it. There was this article that you and I talked about from our old buddy Jerry Del Cagliano. If DAC chips perform perfectly, then why don't all DACs sound the same? And this could have been an interesting article that talked about how reconstruction filters work and things like that. And especially if there's a volume control, how that might affect the performance. But then in the end, his argument just reduced down to, well, more expensive ones are made better, and that means they're better. He ends by saying, what matters is that the upgrades that you invest in make you more and more happy with your system. You're still allowed to be in the audiophile club if you decide that your current DAC is good enough, even if it's a $400 Chi-Fi Darling. Many others who can hear and justify the difference in a more expensive component can make their moves accordingly. See, the argument that he's making there is that, well, if you're a refined man of culture, then you can hear the difference, and therefore you can appreciate spending the money more. Whereas if you're just a schlub who can't afford it or can't hear the difference, I guess it's fine. You can still be in our club. Just understand that you're a junior member, And most of these guys don't say the quiet part out loud the way Jerry does, but I think that notion permeates a lot of the discussion, and that bothers me.
Status and culture, man. If you buy this expensive thing, then you are part of this in-group. And there's so much of this and this is why I've just rebelled so much against this stuff, is, being a musician and realizing, like, I'm spending how many days this week playing and recording music, like every day, and I listen to lots of new stuff. I mean, I listen to music just constantly because I got to test Bluetooth speakers, right? I mean, music is a bigger part of my life than almost any of these, so-called refined men of culture who buy these really expensive toys and think that they're somehow getting more in touch with the music and stuff. So if some audiophile thinks that by buying a $500,000 speaker, he's somehow a necessarily refined man of culture, well, no. Just in the same sense that buying a $200,000 car does not make him a race car driver.
Right. Yeah. Yep.
So I really, there's been so much good discussion on this. And honestly, I don't find myself strongly disagreeing with anybody in this case. I really don't. And the discussion was civil. And this is the first online discussion I've had with Lee that was civil.
That's a good point.
And Doug and Lee, that's not usually going to be a very nice conversation, but it was fine.
So let's do some credits, buddy. We're mixing things up this week. You're editing 2 in a row because we've got some.
Yeah, I'm editing 2 in a row.
You and I both have some upcoming travel. We're both going to Texas, but like a week apart. So we're shuffling around the editing order a little bit. You're doing this one, and I'll take the next one. And
I'm going to commit. I'm going to commit to something, man. Ooh, wow. I'm going to do another tune with the U-Rock guitar.
This is the best news I've heard all week. This is amazing. I'm loving it. Is it going to be like a city pop thing again, or are you going to do like a different?
I don't know, man. I got to go with whatever. I actually, I played that on a $50 bass I bought off Amazon.
Oh yeah.
And so one of those will be dredged up from the the vault of the Butterburger house band, the archive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, buddy. Anything else?
No. Patreon segment coming up.
All right. We'll be right back.
Bye.
Bye. Hey, thanks for sticking around to the end. If you liked what you heard and wish there'd been a little bit more of it, we got some good news for you.
Indeed, we do. If you check out patreon.com/Audio Unleashed, all one word, you can get new episodes a little earlier than everybody else.
And sometimes it's like a day or two early. Sometimes it's nearly a week. We never really know until we start editing.
But the big plus is that you get extended cuts of every episode. And usually that's going to mean a whole extra segment that's about maybe a geekier topic or something that's a little more personal to us or something that's just going to really appeal to the hardcore Audio Unleashed listener.
Yeah, what it boils down to is if you're somebody who would support Audio Unleashed on Patreon, we're going to make sure the bonuses to every episode are really aimed straight at your interests.
Yeah, and so if you want to hear these segments, you can subscribe to our Patreon for $3 a month, which is less than I spend every single day on my cup of coffee when I go to Starbucks to write my boring articles.
Yeah. One more time with that URL, that's patreon.com/Audio Unleashed.
Or Audio
Unleashed. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.